In this lecture, we're going to see how to install AngularJS into your HTML page and how to write our very first AngularJS application. So right now I'm located in my Atom editor and I'm looking at Lecture 04 folder, which is located in the examples in the full stack-course 5 folder. I also pre-started my browser sync, so on the right you see the browser sync basically showing us so far just an empty page from our index.html that we started. So the very first thing we need to do is we need to download AngularJS library itself. So let's go to the browser and we'll switch to this tab, and I already preloaded angularjs.org. So what you want to do is you want to go to develop and click on download. And here we'll tell you all the different versions of AngularJS. Now, since this course is based on AngularJS 1, not AngularJS 2, do not choose anything that has 2 point and so on next to it. Instead, find the latest version of AngularJS 1 point something and click on that, and you'll see a whole bunch of different packages that AngularJS provides. What you want to look for is the one that just is very plain, says angular.js. Well, this is actually the unminified version, the one that has all the spacing in it and all the full named variable names. But in order to save bandwidth, we're going to go ahead and grab angular.min.js. And you can see here, if I right click and click Save Link As, I'll be able to point to the folder in which our Lecture 4 is located. I already did that, so I'm not going to do that again. And you can see here that my angular.min.js is already in the Lecture 04 folder. I also created an additional file where we're going to put our own logic, which is app.js. And in this point, it is just an empty JavaScript file. So the first thing we need to do is we need to reference those two files in our HTML page. Well, I already pre-made that, so I will go ahead and cut and paste it right here. So all we need to do is put two script tags. The first one is angular.min.js and the second one is app.js. And obviously we want our app.js to follow angular.min.js because this is HTML and browsers interpret these lines sequentially. So since we're going to be using AngularJS inside of our app.js, we want that to be processed first and then be available to use inside app.js. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to our app.js and we'll go ahead and hide the sidebar here and let's write our very first AngularJS application. So the very first thing we're going to start with is we're going to start with an IFI, an immediately invoked function expression. If you don't remember what that is, please look in the previous course where it explains in detail why we want to do something like that. But in short, we want to make sure that no local variables bleed into the global scope. So once we've defined our IFI, we're ready to start our AngularJS application. And the very first thing we want to do is define our main app, the thing that's going to be responsible for some chunk of HTML in our index.html. So the thing that AngularJS exposes on the global scope is really just one particular object, and that object is called Angular. So Angular is we're able to now execute things on it. And one of the things we're able to do is say module and define our module, and we'll call it my first app. And the first thing that this module method takes is the name of our application. And the second is a list of dependencies that our module or our application is going to need in the form of an array. In this case, we're going to just leave it as an empty array because we have no dependencies at this point at all, just a regular plain AngularJS application. So when we go ahead and define that, we can now go ahead and hook up this my first app into our index.html. So if we go to index.html, there's a special attribute that we could place really anywhere we want, but usually you want to put it on the very outer tag that you want the Angular application to be responsible for. And the attribute is called ng-app, which stands for Angular application. And we want to name it exactly the same way we named it in our app.js, which is my first app. So when we save that, now it means that anything in this DOM tree from the beginning where we mentioned ng-app to the end of that tag, which in this case is beginning HTML and end HTML, our Angular application is responsible for. So this module has now been bound, this AngularJS app has been bound to our HTML. Now, almost in all cases, you don't want to just stop there. What we want to do is want to define another construct of Angular that will be responsible for a smaller portion of our page. For example, just this div. So what we're going to go is we're going to go to app.js and we're going to go ahead and remove the semicolon. And since module function returns module instance, we can just go ahead and chain the next call to .controller. And .controller function is really the way we define the view model of our view being index.html. So it takes two things. Number one, it takes the name of our view model or the name of our controller, and we'll call it my first controller. And it takes a function that defines the functionality for that particular controller. So when I save that right here, I now have my first controller available, being that its functionality is defined by this function, which at this point is empty. It's available to be bound to our view. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's copy that and go to our index.html and say ngController equals to my first controller. So when I do that now, everything below this div and until this div is closed is being controlled by this my first controller, because Angular looks for this name inside of our app.js and sees that this name matches right here, this controller, and knows that the function responsible for that piece of functionality inside of our view is this function right here. So if I save that, and I should see no errors whatsoever, at this point we haven't really implemented any functionality, but we have at this point bound things in our JavaScript to things that are in our index.html. So if you think back to what we discussed about view and the view model, this is that relationship. This index.html is really the view, or in this particular case, just this div is really a piece of a view, and this piece of the view is being bound to app.js, and in particular being bound to this function defined by the controller. This binding or this binder is happening automatically, and it's done by AngularJS for you. There's one more best practice that I'd like to insert here that we should use from now on, and that is declaring our function with useStrict. useStrict. And when we do that, we're enabling certain things to just protect us from making mistakes. For example, we know that the entire IFI construct that we've put in here is there to protect us from bleeding things into the global scope. But what happens if I say, and I'll go ahead and comment this useStrict for now, what happens if I say x equals hello? Well, according to the rules of JavaScript, since x has not been defined with a var keyword, it will go ahead and define itself on the global scope. Now, usually that's not what we want to do, and we don't want these type of mistakes by accident to kind of slip by. So if we use strict, let's uncomment that now, and go ahead and save that, you'll see that the browser is complaining and saying that x is not defined. In other words, it's seeing that x is really defined inside of a function, yet it has no var keyword in front of it. And if I put the var keyword in front of it, it will go ahead and not complain anymore. So from now on, we're going to use our IFI, immediately invoked function expression, and we'll use useStrict to make sure we don't make any careless mistakes that will probably hurt us down the road. In the next lecture, we're going to see a little bit more about what this controller can do and how it can directly affect the view that is the index.html.